This is the online lecture slideshow for Philosophy 131, Learning Module 5, Part 2 of 3. The subject is Proofs of God. See Learning Module 5 in SACS-ET, Arguments for the Existence of God. In this module, you will see how classical philosophers such as Thomas Aquinas and Samuel Clarke attempt to prove that God exists using experience-based a posteriori and principle-based a priori arguments. We examine critically essential but controversial assumptions of cosmological arguments, especially the principle of universal causation, which is a version of the more general principle of sufficient reason. That is, the idea that nothing whatsoever happens which is not caused. We end this part of the module, which is part 2 of 3, with a consideration of what modern philosophers and physicists who study the origin of the cosmos have to say about causes, events, and the origin of the universe. The specific learning objectives for this slideshow are answers to these questions. Number 1. What are cosmological arguments? Number 2. What are two of the classical cosmological arguments that Thomas Aquinas presents? Number 3. What is Samuel Clarke's argument from contingency? Number 4. What criticisms of the cosmological argument do philosophers Paul Edwards and William Rowe present? Number 5. Do physicists who study the origins of the cosmos think that the universe must have an ultimate cause? Question 1. What are cosmological arguments? Such arguments support belief in the existence of a first cause, or uncaused cause of the universe, based on a posteriori evidence, that is, specific observed facts about the universe, justify our inferring that a superpowerful creator being exists. The evidence. Things move, change happens, events cause other events. Why? Answer. God did it, ultimately. Define God as an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good creator of the cosmos, or an all-PKG being, or the omnigod, the OG. Why bother proving that God exists? Why bother proving that the God of the Jews, Christians, and Muslims exist? Answer. God is great. Anything less would not be worth respecting. Sure, one need not prove using logic and observation that God exists, but one earns respect or understanding if one succeeds. Also, one can then ground further claims about God as the source of absolute universal moral values and duties. For example, suppose one assumes that if God exists, then objective moral values exist. Well, if you can prove that God exists, then you have a proof by implication that values that are not relative or subjective or simply made up by humans actually exist. Again, the fact that one has a proof does not mean that the proof is good. A proof is just an argument, and some arguments are better than others. When evaluating arguments, we must separate whether the reasoning, the logic, is valid or strong, from whether the assumptions and alleged facts are true. Where did it all come from? Question 2. What are two of the classical cosmological arguments that Thomas Aquinas presents? Thomas Aquinas, the argument from motion. Here is Aquinas' argument. Assumption 1. Some objects are in motion. Observations confirm this. We look around us, we see things moving. Hard to deny. Assumption 2. If something is in motion, then it must be caused to be in motion by something outside of itself. We'll call this Aristotle's assumption. Assumption 3. Causes must precede their effects. This is the definition of a cause. A cause must come before whatever it is it produces, it affects. Assumption 4. There can be no infinite chain of movers, movies. We'll call this Aquinas' assumption. 5. So, there is a first unmoved mover. 6. Therefore, God exists. God exists, and God is that unmoved mover, that ultimate cause of whatever is moving. Everything that moves can trace its origin, its movement, back to an original thing which moved it, namely God. This comes from Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologia, circa 1274. Let's consider some of the problems philosophers find with Aquinas' argument from motion. Assumption 1 is acceptable. Some objects are in motion. This is fairly obvious. We don't need everything to move, but if some things move, we wonder, well, why do they move? Assumption 2. And this assumption comes from Aristotle's physics. If something is in motion, then it must be caused to be in motion by something outside of itself. Okay, this is false. Modern physics and Newtonian mechanics allow for eternally moving entities. To move eternally is to never stop moving. Newton's first law states that every object will remain at rest or in uniform motion in a straight line unless compelled to change its state by the action of an external force. This is the definition of inertia. The point here is that when there is no net force acting on an object, if all the external forces cancel each other out, then the object will maintain a constant velocity. If that velocity is zero, then the object remains at rest. If an external force is applied, the velocity will change because of the force. In 1687, Newton states this more specifically. Unless acted upon by an unbalanced force, an object will maintain a constant velocity. Aristotle was also wrong about this. Heavier things fall faster, the speed of fall being proportional to the weight. Test it. Air resistance, not weight, makes the difference. Assumption 3, causes must precede their effects. This is a definition. People accept this. Assumption 4. This is a key assumption which Aquinas makes. Lots of people presume this. There are reasons not to believe it. Again, it says, there can be no infinite chain of movers, movies. You just can't keep going back into the past and saying, C was caused by B, and B was caused by A, and A was caused by something prior. That's got to stop somewhere, Aquinas thinks. Common sense, he thinks, says that. But this is just false. Perhaps inconceivable, hard for us to understand or comprehend, but not logically impossible. Why not? Since some or many eternally moving things are possible. Again, if we have things that move eternally, then we can imagine the chain going back in time to something moving that never stopped moving, that never was set in motion, something which moves eternally. Okay? Claim 5. So, there is a first unmoved mover. This is false. Other unmoved movers, besides the omnigod, are also possible. So, what Aquinas does is he moves straight from the idea that there is probably a first unmoved mover to that the first unmoved mover is God, the Judeo-Christian Muslim God. And that's a very big leap. It could be a committee of gods, or one not so great, non-God, or gods of the Hindus, or deists. And so Aquinas' conclusion that God exists is dubious, or just plain false. We may only conclude, if anything at all, that some unmoved mover exists, not that the Judeo-Christian Muslim omnigod creator of something from nothing exists. Alternate unmoved movers are also possible. Other creator gods are possible. Hindu gods of the Trimurti, Brahma, Shiva, Vishnu, Brahma the creator, Shiva the preserver, and Vishnu the destroyer, are also possible. Millions of people believe this. Let's look at another argument from Thomas Aquinas. This is his argument from first cause. Now I'm simplifying this, but here it is in 6 statements. Claim 1. Events or things happen. Number 2. Events cause other events. Number 3. When an event happens, then it must be caused by something other than itself. Claim 4. There can be no infinite cause-effect chains of events. Claim 5. So, there is a first uncaused cause, which is itself outside of nature. Aquinas and many others presume this. 6. Therefore, God exists. Here's the first problem. Claim 5 is actually a very big assumption. the idea that there is a first uncaused cause, which is itself outside of nature. The issue is this: do we even need a first cause? The first cause is supposed to be the required ultimate cause of everything. Without one, there could be nothing. No matter, no things, no sequences of events, no self-reproducing organisms, etc. But what a posteriori evidence is there for this ultimate reality, if it exists outside of nature, which is all we can observe, and yet is somehow responsible for all of nature? The universe could itself be uncaused, eternal, just like the alleged uncaused first cause, which Aquinas identifies as God. Okay, this is the second problem. Look again at premise 3, the idea that when an event happens, it must be caused by something other than itself. I mean, sometimes this is true, right? But the idea is, according to this, it's always true. Premise 3 is false if something exists that has no beginning. Perhaps the universe itself, or some part of it, is eternal or infinitely old. Aquinas thinks that every event has a cause, but then contradicts himself by inferring that God, and only God, is uncaused or eternal. Which is it? Physicists think at least some matter is conceivably eternal, energy is conserved, and that there may be an infinity of recurring universes. There is much more to this, so we need to focus exclusively on Claim 3 and what it presumes. Let's focus on premise 3. Again, premise 3 says, when an event happens, then it must be caused by something other than itself. But premise 3 is false if there are any uncaused events. Premise 3 expresses what is called the principle of universal causality. It's the idea that whatever exists has a cause of its existence. This follows from a more general principle. We call it the principle of sufficient reason. It's the idea that everything in the natural world has a cause. However, by what reasoning, a priori or a posteriori, do we justify this principle or its variance? Experience? Logic? We certainly assume this. Ask yourself this: is it impossible for something to happen that was not caused to happen? Most people think that it is impossible. Why? Because they say nothing can happen unless it is caused. But this just presumes what we need to prove. It is circular reasoning. Humans have not experienced every event, so can hardly say all events are caused. We just presume it, since we think we have never seen any uncaused event or thing. We ascribe a cause to everything. Physicists think that some events don't have causes. For example, quantum events don't have causes. Subatomic particles change position or excitation state spontaneously. Radioactive decay in the nucleus of an atom is uncaused. It happens for no reason. The result of a coin or die toss or a roulette wheel spin is random, not just unpredictable, since the specific result is uncaused. You throw the dice, sure, but whichever of 36 possible outcomes occurs is random. Genetic mutations are often random, not just unpredictable, but spontaneous or uncaused. Mutations don't happen for a specific reason, purpose, or goal, although sometimes they can be caused by humans deliberately, say when one gets exposed to radiation. Multiple leaf clovers, though rare, are random mutations. More examples of random events. Unstable. Atomic nuclei spontaneously lose energy by emitting ionizing particles and radiation. When all causally relevant parameters are controlled, there will still be some aspects of the outcome which vary randomly. Atoms in a radioactive substance, such as uranium-238, decay in a random fashion, but at a characteristic rate. The length of time this takes, the number of steps required, and the kinds of radiation released at each step are well known. The half-life is the time taken for half of the atoms of a radioactive substance to decay. Here's the point. In the radioactive decay of an atomic nucleus, an alpha, beta, or gamma particle begins to exist spontaneously without an apparent cause. If anything ever just happens, then the principle that whatever happens has a reason or a cause is going to be false. So, is anything ever truly random? The Oxford English Dictionary defines random as having no definite aim or purpose, not sent or guided in a particular direction, made, done, occurring, etc., without method or conscious choice, haphazard. For example, the density of freckles that appear on a person's skin is controlled by genes and exposure to light, whereas the exact location of individual freckles seems to be random. The distribution of freckles seems to be entirely random and not associated with any other obviously punctuate anatomical or physiological feature of skin. Here's a reply to this. Wait a minute. These phenomena are caused events. We just can't say when or where they're going to happen, so that they are spontaneous or not predetermined does not make them uncaused. We just don't know the causes. Rejoinder. You are just assuming what you need to prove. This amounts to saying that whatever begins to exist has a cause is just plain true, no matter what. But what evidence is there for this? Spontaneous events happen, but are not caused. Events or things prior are not necessarily causes. If any stuff happens without being caused, then your general principle is mistaken. So, premise 3 of Aquinas' first cause argument is dubious. Here's a summary. The biggest problem with cosmological arguments is the assumption that whatever exists was caused to exist by something outside of itself. People assume without proof that no self-caused or eternal or uncaused entities are possible. But why not? There are no logical or physical inconsistencies with the existence of uncaused things, unless you just presume that there can't be uncaused things to begin with. I'll say more about this later. The universality of the principle of causality, the idea that everywhere, for everything, every when, whatever happens, had to be caused by something else, is presupposed by the cosmological arguments of Aquinas and others. We understand why people think it because it looks like it's true. However, many physicists today do not accept that this principle is always true, or true for everything. There exists quantum mechanical phenomena and discontinuities, causal anomalies, randomness in the radioactive and chemical particles, etc. If Big Bang cosmology is true, the universe, according to Stephen Hawking, does not have a boundary. The universe would be completely self-contained and not affected by anything outside itself. It would neither be created nor destroyed. It would just be. This is from physicist Stephen Hawking's 1988 Brief History of Time. Question 3. What is Samuel Clarke's argument from contingency? Here's Samuel Clarke's argument in 5 statements. This comes from his discourse concerning the being and attributes of God, the obligations of natural religion, and the truth and certainty of the Christian revelation, published in 1705. Claim 1. Every entity is either necessary, exists independently, or it is contingent, that is, it exists dependently. Claim 2. But not every entity can be contingent. Claim 3. There exists a necessary entity upon which contingent entities depend for their existence. Claim 4. This necessary entity is God. Claim 5, and its conclusion, therefore God exists. Now, Clarke's argument is an a priori argument. It's based on thinking about the concept of contingent as opposed to necessary beings. It's based on reasoning alone. It's not based on observations. Look again at premises 1 through 3. He is not using any experience to justify these assumptions. He uses ideas and logic only. His argument's a priori because he uses the principle of sufficient reason, or the idea that nothing exists which was not caused to exist by something else. He uses this to argue from a contingent series of causes to a necessary being, namely God. We need to take a closer look at Samuel Clarke's argument from contingency. Let's examine premise 1. Every entity is either necessary, that is, it exists independently, or it is contingent, which means it exists dependently. Claim 2, but not every entity can be contingent. Claim 3, there exists a necessary entity upon which contingent entities depend for their existence. Claim 4, this necessary entity, this is God. His conclusion, Claim 5, therefore, God exists. This argument comes from his discourse concerning the being and attributes of God, the obligations of natural religion, and the truth and certainty of the Christian revelation, published in 1705. There are problems with Clarke's argument from contingency, mostly rooted in the assumption, his premise 1. Every entity is either necessary or contingent. For Clarke, contingent means dependent. Such entities can't exist unless at least one necessary entity exists, he thinks. This means that contingent entities are always caused or explained by another. For example, atoms, rocks, buildings, and persons are contingent entities. For Clarke, necessary means independent. Such entities are not caused, explained by another. For example, God is an independent entity. God doesn't owe God's existence to anything else. Clarke says, for since something must needs have been from eternity, means some being or other must have always existed. According to Clarke, if there were only an endless series of dependent beings in the universe, that series must have its cause either from within the series or outside the series, because everything must have a cause. Problem. He neglects the possibility that some contingent beings, which might not have existed, do exist and yet were not caused by anything. Some things, some events, might not have causes. Clarke and others assume that the principle of sufficient reason is true. The principle of sufficient reason is, again, the idea that nothing happens without a reason. It has many formulations and implications. Probably the most common form is the notion that everything has a cause. But a good argument for it is lacking. We just presume it. We assume it has no exceptions. The principle of sufficient reason, perhaps introduced first by Leibniz in the early 1700s, is a principle that applies to events, not things. However, since events are complex phenomena comprised of things happening at specific times and places, we can say derivatively that the principle of sufficient reason also pertains to things. The primary justification for accepting this principle seems to be that we don't observe exceptions to it. It appears to us that whatever occurs had a prior cause or reason. However, this is a poor justification. That we can ascribe a cause to every event does not mean every event has a cause. Also, the fact that we cannot imagine any event without a cause or reason is a weak reason. We don't want to limit what's possible to what we can imagine or experience. I can't imagine that the universe has 10 or more dimensions, yet that is what physicists and mathematicians conclude. So again, the problem is going to be that first premise. Every entity is either necessary or contingent. Clarke confuses contingent, as in dependent on some other, with contingent as in might not have existed. Every human is contingent in both senses. Our existence depends on others, our parents, and their parents, etc. Each human might not have existed. Some other human might have existed in their stead, or maybe there could be no humans. We can imagine bits of matter, say, some subatomic particles that are not. He also confuses necessary as in must exist with is independent of anything else. These are different concepts. The point, some matter might have always existed, and thus not depend for its existence on anything else. Such matter need not ever have existed, since had the universe developed differently, it might not have existed at all, even though whether it exists depends on the cosmic evolution of some universe or other, or a multiverse. Clarke presumes that whatever is contingent must have a cause, but he overlooks the possibility that there exist contingent entities which have always existed but might not have ever existed. Samuel Clarke presumes that whatever is contingent must have a cause, but he overlooks the possibility that there exist contingent entities which have always existed, uncaused, but might not have ever existed. Contingent means non-necessary, yes, but only sometimes means dependent. For example, perhaps there was never a time when nothing existed. That is, there was never nothing rather than something. So we don't need to wonder why there is something rather than nothing, because there was just always something. People who believe in God already think this. God is the ultimate something which has always existed. Whatever something there is at any moment and in totality is comprised of atoms and empty space. Now imagine Alvin the atom. Alvin is a contingent, non-necessary entity, since Alvin could have not existed. Instead of Alvin, Arthur the atom, a different contingent atom, could have existed. So Alvin the atom is one of many atoms, all of which are eternal and uncaused, but none of which are necessary to the history of the cosmos. Thus, something could be contingent but not have a cause. Different atoms might have existed, sure, but whatever atoms do exist are eternal. They need no causes. The same goes for the cosmos, which could have always existed and thus requires no cause, even if all of its components are contingent. Why does Clarke accept the idea that every entity is either necessary or contingent, and then get from this that whatever is contingent owes its existence to what's necessary? It's because he thinks that whatever is contingent depends for its existence on something else. He just presumes the principle of sufficient reason, as most of us do. The principle of sufficient reason is the notion that whatever exists or occurs has got to have an explanation. It must have a cause. But the principle is not a priori true. It is not necessarily true. And our common sense intuitions amount to a preference only for principle of sufficient reason explanations. The principle is not obvious or trivial, and it begs the question, is anything uncaused? By presuming that the answer is no. If yes, if anything uncaused could exist, then there need be no explanation for the fact that there are and always have been dependent beings, or any infinite series of them either. The principle of sufficient reason, also called universal causation, exists in many forms. Here are three. For every event E, if E occurs, then there is a sufficient explanation for why E occurs. So this is the principle of sufficient reason applied to events. There's a version we can apply to propositions. For every proposition, say 7 plus 5 equals 12, if the proposition is true, then there is a sufficient explanation for why the proposition is true. The principle of sufficient reason also has a form which applies to entities. For every entity X, if X exists, then there is a sufficient explanation for why X exists. Modern science, mathematics, logic, and philosophy no longer presume any form of the principle of sufficient reason when theorizing about what there is, and why what there is exists and behave as it does. The principle of sufficient reason is a major essential presumption in all cosmological arguments, but it is questionable. Is the principle of sufficient reason justified? Is this a compelling argument? Whatever happens is caused. Whatever is caused has a sufficient reason. So whatever happens has a reason. Therefore, everything happens for a reason. Now, most people believe everything happens for a reason, and here's an argument for that belief. But there are problems. The first premise is going to be false if some events or things are uncaused. To say that whatever happens is caused is not right if some things happen which aren't caused. The second premise is another problem. The second premise is false if some caused events or outcomes happened for no reason. The second premise says whatever is caused has a sufficient reason. Whatever is caused has a reason. Well, suppose some things happen spontaneously. Suppose some things happen which are caused but don't have reasons. Chance, luck, spontaneous events, and quantum level phenomena violate the principle of sufficient reason, which is claim 4 here. Everything happens for a reason. Because elementary particles exhibit behavior without any observable external cause. Modern science, mathematics, logic, and philosophy no longer presume the principle of sufficient reason. That is, that everything in the universe has a cause. But most people do, still do. We still reason presuming it. So the principle of sufficient reason is not true, necessarily. Sure, some things, some events have causes, or have reasons for happening. This is indisputable. But this is not enough evidence for believing that all events have causes. For example, some events are planned, but can we conclude from this that all events are planned? Accidents happen. In short, you would have to stop talking about luck or spontaneity or stuff just happening if it was really true that all events have causes or reasons. So the principle of sufficient reason or universal causation is dubious or false. Any argument relying upon it as a presumption overlooks uncaused events or things. Another version of the problem is when people say that something was meant to be. This also presumes that the principle of sufficient reason is true. I have made the case in this slideshow and reconstruction of Clarke's argument that not only is presumption 1 dubious, the move from premise 1 to 2 is also a problem. So let's focus more on premise 2, the idea that not every entity can be contingent. Clarke, we can agree with Clarke on this, but it doesn't get him what he wants. The reasonable idea Clarke has here is that you can't get something from nothing. However, he presumes that once upon a time there was nothing. But perhaps there was always something. That something could be God or some earlier universe, or an earlier stage of it, or eternal non-contingent parts of it. Premise 3 depends on mistaken premise 2. There's another response. Maybe contingent beings is all there is. The entire collection of such beings might not have an ultimate cause. The cosmos, collection, is not a distinct entity needing explaining then. The universe is just there and that's all. There was always something. Makes perfect sense given physics, even if we choose to call the Big Bang a beginning. See The Uncaused Beginning of the Universe, published in 1988 by Quentin Smith, for more on this. A series or collection of contingent entities without one ultimate cause is possible. Any set of such entities does not need to be explained by one ultimate cause or even any cause. This is Paul Edwards' point. So let's take a moment here and map out, make a chart of what exists and how. There are caused things, stuff, phenomena, and there are uncaused things. For caused things, some of them have beginnings and some don't. For uncaused things, some of them have beginnings and some don't. Here are the possibilities. Among the things which have beginnings and are caused, we have lesser gods, demons, angels, a multiverse, the cosmos, space-time itself, ordinary things like you and I and buildings, concrete things, most events. There are also caused things, stuff, phenomena which don't have a beginning. Now, this is conceptually impossible. If it's true that whatever is caused to exist has a beginning, you can't have any things or stuff or happenings that don't have a beginning. Now, if universal causation is false, then you could have caused things which have no beginning. Let's take a look at the category uncaused things, stuff, phenomena. There are two kinds of uncaused things conceivable, namely those with beginnings and those without. Some examples of things which are uncaused but have a beginning might be some eternal entities. A mother universe, one which is responsible for subsequent universes or even our own. Subatomic phenomena. Not all subatomic phenomena, but such things as radioactive decay. Say a carbon-14 atom electron emits radiation and becomes a nitrogen-14 atom. There are uncaused things which have no beginning. Now, Clarke and Aquinas and many believe God is the prime example of this. In fact, many believe God is the only example of this. But perhaps there are abstract entities such as numbers and truths and colors and properties and all sorts of other propositions which are not caused to be true, not caused to exist, and have no beginning. They're eternal truths. Are there any eternal truths which don't begin to be true? You see it? The multiverse itself. Strings, these strands of energy comprising all matter in modern cosmology theory. So let's now look at premise 3 in Clarke's argument, the idea that there exists a necessary entity upon which contingent entities depend for their existence. Premise 3 in Clarke's argument is key. There exists a necessary entity upon which contingent entities depend for their existence. I've said a lot about this. This is the big problem. Clarke presumes that the principle of sufficient reason is true. But uncaused, random, spontaneous events are possible. Eternal or infinite entities are possible. The universe might not have been caused or created at all. So the principle of sufficient reason is not always or not necessarily true. Now we have premise 4 in Clarke's argument. This necessary entity is God. Even if assumption 3 is true, even if there exists a necessary entity upon which contingent entities depend for their existence, other creative or organizing causes are possible. Multiple causes are possible. Other gods, lesser gods, are possible. So even if something's necessary, it need not be the Judeo-Christian Muslim God. Clarke concludes, therefore, God exists. At best, at least one thing might exist if a first cause is required to bring into existence any contingent entities. Even if this is so, that it must be the Judeo-Christian Muslim omnigod and not some other natural object, process, remains to be proven. Question 4. What criticisms of the cosmological argument do philosophers Paul Edwards and William Rowe present? Paul Edwards thinks that no first cause is necessary, and neither is the universe or anything in it. What's the relation between causes and their effects? Edwards draws a distinction between two kinds of causes, a cause in fieri and a cause in esse. A cause in fieri is any factor that brings effect X into existence. For example, parents, manufacturers, artisans are causes in fieri of their children, products, artifacts. A cause in esse is any factor that sustains X. For example, light, oxygen, food are causes in esse of organisms, which would not continue to exist in their absence. Aquinas and Clarke believe that infinite, unending series of causes are impossible. They presume that God is a cause in esse and so also a cause in fieri, because any series of objects and their prior causes has a cause in esse. But this is a mistake, Edwards thinks. Edwards thinks that if there were an infinite series of causes in fieri or in esse, then this would show that we do not need an ultimate first cause. A series of causes and effects, or a sequence of events, could have a cause in esse without having a cause in fieri. Consider his Eskimos example. Paul Edwards tells the 5 Eskimos story. Suppose I see a group of 5 Eskimos standing on the corner of 6th Avenue and 50th Street, and I wish to explain why the group came to New York. Investigation reveals the following stories. Eskimo 1 did not enjoy the extreme cold in the polar region. She decided to move to a warmer climate. Eskimo 2 is the husband of Eskimo number 1. He loves her dearly and did not wish to live without her. Eskimo 3 is the son of Eskimos 1 and 2. He is too small and too weak to oppose his parents. Eskimo 4 saw an advertisement in the New York Times for an Eskimo to appear on television. He is auditioning for the role. Eskimo 5 is a private detective, engaged by the Pinkerton Agency to keep an eye on Eskimo 4. He is not interested in Eskimos 1, 2, or 3. What's the point of this story Edwards tells? Let's assume that we have now explained in the case of each of the 5 Eskimos why he or she is in New York. Somebody then asks, okay, but what about the group as a whole? Why is it in New York? This is an absurd question, since it presumes that there must be one ultimate explanation overall. There is nothing beyond the 5 individual members, and if we have explained why each of the 5 members is in New York, we have thus explained why the group is there. It is silly to ask for the cause of the series or group as a whole, instead of just asking for the specific causes of the individuals. Once you show that each individual member of a collection of contingent people or things has a separate explanation, no further or ultimate explanation is necessary. Some explanation for each is desirable, sure, but we don't need one explanation for all of them, taken as a group. The demand to find the cause of a series of events or things as a whole rests on the erroneous assumption that the series is something over and above the members of which it is composed. Let's review. Edwards concludes that no first cause is necessary, and neither is the universe or anything in it necessary. Edwards says, if an infinite series of causes in fieri or in esse are possible, then this would show that we do not need an ultimate first cause of the series of events and things comprising the total cosmos, separate from the cosmos itself. An infinite series of contingent beings, say existing matter or atoms, could be uncaused causes, cause in fieri of everything. The cosmos itself does not need any sustaining cause or cause in esse, although parts of it might. If we explain or specify the cause of each member of a causal series, we do not need to provide an explanation of the whole series over and above the series itself. So, cosmological arguments, which assume the necessity of first causes, fail to prove that any first cause necessarily exists, and don't prove that if there is a first cause, that it must be supernatural. William Rowe, An Examination of the Cosmological Argument. William Rowe maintains that we just accept the principle of sufficient reason and project it onto whatever we observe. William Rowe maintains that we just accept the principle of sufficient reason and project it onto whatever we observe. Assuming the principle means we expect that there must be an explanation of the existence of any entity and of any positive fact whatsoever. Cosmological arguments assume mistakenly that whatever exists is A, explained by another, or B, explained by itself, but overlook a third option, C, explained by nothing. An entity which is explained by nothing needs no explanation. It might be eternal or uncaused or spontaneously emergent. People say, God always was and always will be. But if it works for God, why not others, say the cosmos or its constituents? Always existing things need no explanation. Why shall we presume there can only be one of these? So this is how you explain things by nothing. Some things don't need explaining, they were always there. Further, any causal series of events or things might be infinite. There's no logical contradiction in this, and thus the series has no ultimate cause at all. Modern physicists call the Big Bang the beginning of the universe as we know it. It is entirely consistent with physics that the universe is eternal or that it is not. Data are insufficient either way. William Rowe makes the point that nature is not bound to satisfy our assumptions. The principle of sufficient reason implies that whatever begins to exist has a cause, but it's not intuitive or obvious. Apart from just accepting it and applying it, it's supported by and consistent with our observations of events and things causing other events and things. However, is this collective experience enough for us to say it is true everywhere, every when, for everything? Consider how limited, biased, and short-sighted, often mistaken our samplings of the cosmos and its phenomena are. Also, it's not irrational to deny the principle of sufficient reason. Scientific explanations of the cosmos are compatible with there being a first cause, natural or supernatural. Scientific explanations are also compatible with there being no first cause. An eternal universe or sequence of universes or a multiverse can be all there is. Some things are caused and some are not. In short, we have insufficient reason to extend the principle of sufficient reason to the whole of the universe and everything in it. We see lots of changes, but causes are often elusive. Nevertheless, we expect that there must be a cause for whatever happens. Do physicists who study the origins of the cosmos think that the universe must have an ultimate cause? Cosmologists think different origin scenarios for the universe are possible. Physicists say that the laws of physics and chemistry are sufficient to account for the origin and structure of the present state of the universe, without presuming that something came from nothing, or presuming that whatever begins to exist was caused to exist. This defies common sense, but common sense is too often mistaken to trust. It's conceivable that the universe began approximately 13.7 billion years ago, and that it was uncaused. There is sufficient evidence to justify the belief that the universe began to exist without being caused to do so. This evidence includes the Hawking-Penrose singularity theorems that are based on Einstein's general theory of relativity and the recently introduced quantum cosmological models of the universe. These are not something from nothing theories. Or the universe might be cyclic. Ours is one in an eternal series, each beginning with a big bang and ending with a big crunch. Big Bang Theory neither says nor implies that the universe came from nothing or that the universe had a cause. Possibly, there is no moment of time at which our universe or some prior state of it did not exist. Big Bang Theory only says, in the distant past, the universe was very dense and hot. Since then, it has expanded, becoming less dense and cooler. That's it. You owe it to yourself to see what physicists say about this. They present a timeline of the universe which looks like this. Namely, the universe evolved over the past 13.7 billion years. Here's the last logical point I'll make. Cosmological arguments also commit the birthday fallacy. If everyone has a birthday, does not logically imply that there is a single day in which everyone was born, then all events have some causes does not logically imply that there is one cause, which is the cause of all events. One cause, or multiple causes, or no causes are possible. Such causes might be one God, many gods, natural processes, or no gods. Summarizing now, first cause, cosmological arguments overlook alternatives. Recall the argument, everything has a cause, nothing is its own cause, causal chains of events or things cannot go on forever, so there has to be a first cause. That first cause is God. Conclusion, therefore God exists. However, our premise 1 should be something else. It should be either A, everything has a cause, or there is at least one thing that does not. But if A is the case, then God does too. So God did it is not a solution. What caused God? The principle of sufficient reason demands an explanation. Or if B is the case, then the universe could not have a cause. It is eternal, say. There was always something. There is no need to say something came from nothing or that there needed to be something, namely God, to make it happen. Something was always there. Or, if B is the case, then the universe could not have a cause. It is eternal. There was always something. So, there is no need to say something came from nothing, or that there needed to be something, namely God, to make it happen. Something was always there. There is room enough for God, or other gods, or some other first cause, but there is also the possibility that no first cause is necessary. Perhaps the universe is all there is. This is the end of Learning Module 5, Part 2 of 3 slideshow.